I shouldn't have said that word. Not in a room like that. Not to a man like him. But exhaustion makes you careless and fear makes you stupid, and that night I was both. The music was too loud, the lights too bright, and my feet had been killing me for the last 6 hours, heels digging into skin that had long since gone numb. And all I wanted was to get through my shift without spilling anything or drawing attention. Because attention in a place like this never meant anything good. It meant eyes, questions, trouble I couldn't afford. So I kept my head down, tray steady, smile polite, moving between tables filled with people who wore watches that cost more than my rent and spoke in low voices that carried more weight than they should have. And I told myself just a few more hours, just make it to midnight, just survive. But then someone grabbed my wrist, not hard, just enough to stop me, and I turned too fast, heart already racing, and without thinking, without looking, I said it, soft, automatic, the way you say it to someone you think you know, relax, baby, I've got it. And the second the word left my mouth, I knew something was wrong, because the air changed. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It was slower than that, like a ripple moving outward, conversations thinning, laughter fading, until all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the faint clink of glass somewhere behind me. And the hand on my wrist didn't let go. It tightened just slightly, enough to ground me, enough to keep me from stepping back, and when I finally looked up, really looked, my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with instinct. Because the man standing in front of me wasn't someone you called baby, not by accident, not ever. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, dressed in a suit so perfectly fitted it looked like it belonged to him more than his own skin, dark hair brushed back, sharp features that didn't soften even under the warm glow of the chandeliers, and his eyes, they weren't angry, which somehow made it worse. They were calm, steady, watching me the way people watch something they haven't decided what to do with yet. And that's when I noticed the others, men in similar suits, positioned just far enough to look casual, but close enough to matter, their attention fixed on me in a way that made my pulse spike, and I realized, too late, that I had just stepped into something I didn't understand, something I couldn't fix with an apology and a polite smile. And I tried anyway. Of course I did. Because what else was I supposed to do? I pulled my wrist back slowly, carefully, forcing a small laugh that didn't sound like mine and said, I'm sorry, I thought you were someone else. But he didn't move, didn't react the way normal people do, didn't wave it off or turn away. He just tilted his head slightly, studying me like I'd just said something far more interesting than I intended. And then, slowly, his lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a quiet, controlled expression that sent a chill down my spine because it wasn't kind and it wasn't amused. It was something else entirely. Something deliberate. And when he finally spoke, his voice low enough that only I could hear it, it wasn't anger I heard, it was curiosity. Is that what you call strangers? And I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out because every instinct I had was screaming at me to be careful, to choose my next word like it mattered, because somehow, without meaning to, I had just said the one thing that made him notice me, and I had the terrifying feeling that he wasn't going to forget it. My throat went dry because there was no right answer to that question, not in a place like this, not when every pair of eyes that mattered was quietly shifting in our direction, pretending not to look, but missing nothing, and I could feel it, the weight of attention pressing down on my shoulders, making it harder to breathe, harder to think, so I did the only thing I could do. I told the truth, or at least a version of it. No, I do not, I said softly, forcing my voice to stay steady even though my pulse was anything but. I thought you were someone else, and for a second, just 1 second, I thought that might be enough, that he might lose interest, that he might let me go and this moment would dissolve back into the noise and lights and forgettable faces of the night. But he did not move, did not release me, his fingers still resting lightly around my wrist like he had all the time in the world, like nothing else in the room mattered except the answer he had not decided on yet. And then he glanced down at my hand, at the tray I was still holding with a grip that had gone too tight, knuckles pale under the dim glow, and when his eyes lifted back to mine, something had shifted, not softer, not kinder, just more focused, like he had made a decision I had not been part of. You should be more careful, he said quietly, and his voice did not rise, did not need to, because it carried anyway, cutting through everything else. Words have a way of attaching themselves to people, and I did not know what that meant, not fully, but I understood enough to feel the warning in it, the kind that lingers long after it is spoken, and I nodded quickly, too quickly. I understand, I said, even though I did not. Not really. Not yet. And finally, his hand loosened, releasing my wrist in a way that felt deliberate, controlled, like even letting go was something he chose with purpose, and I took a small step back, just enough to create space, not enough to seem like I was running, because something told me that would be the wrong move, the kind of mistake you do not get to fix, and for a brief moment I thought it was over, that I could turn, walk away, disappear into the blur of servers and guests and music, pretend none of this had happened. But then one of the men behind him shifted, stepping forward slightly, his expression tightening as he looked at me like I was a problem that needed to be handled. And the air changed again, sharper this time, more dangerous in a way that made my instincts flare, and before I could even process it, before I could decide whether to speak or stay silent, the man in front of me lifted his hand just slightly, not even looking back, and that single movement was enough to stop everything. The other man froze mid-step, tension hanging in the space between them, and I realized then, with a clarity that settled deep in my chest, that nothing happened around this man without his permission, not a word, not a movement, not even a breath if he decided otherwise, and it should have terrified me more than it did. It should have sent me running. But instead there was something else mixed in with the fear, something quieter, more complicated, because he had not let them touch me, had not let them turn my mistake into something worse. And when his attention returned to me, that same unreadable calm in his eyes, I felt it again, that pull I did not understand, like I had stepped into a story I had never meant to be part of. And he said, almost casually, like we were discussing something ordinary instead of something that felt like it could change everything, "What is your name?" And for a second I hesitated, because names felt important now in a way they had not a few minutes ago, like giving it to him meant something I could not take back. But the silence stretched, and I knew better than to refuse. "Emily," I said finally, my voice quieter than before, and his gaze held mine for a fraction longer, just long enough to make my heart stumble, before he nodded once, as if committing it to memory, and then, with that same faint, dangerous smile, he said, "Emily, be careful who you call that next time." And something in the way he said it made it clear he was not talking about anyone else. I should have walked away right then, should have disappeared into the crowd and pretended none of it had happened, but my legs did not move, and somehow that felt like another mistake waiting to happen, because standing there under his gaze felt different now, heavier, like the air itself had shifted around us, and I was caught in something I did not understand. And even when he turned slightly, attention drifting back to the room like nothing unusual had taken place, I could still feel it, that invisible thread tying me to the moment, to him, to the single word I could not take back. And I told myself to breathe, to focus, to do my job. So I adjusted my grip on the tray and stepped away carefully, each step measured, controlled, like I was learning how to walk again under a new set of rules I had never agreed to. And the music slowly returned, conversations picking back up in cautious waves. But something had changed. I could see it in the way people glanced in his direction and then quickly looked away, in the way the staff moved a little faster, a little quieter, as if the entire room had been reminded of something they preferred to forget. And I tried to blend back into that rhythm, to become invisible again. But it was too late for that. I knew at the moment one of the senior servers leaned in close and whispered under her breath, "Do you even know who that is?" And I shook my head before I could stop myself, because admitting ignorance suddenly felt dangerous too. And she exhaled slowly, like I had just confirmed her worst assumption. "You need to be careful," she said, echoing his words in a way that made my stomach tighten. People do not talk to him like that. And I wanted to ask why, wanted to understand exactly how bad this was. But she was already pulling away, already moving to the next table like she had said too much. And that was when it hit me, not all at once, but in pieces, in the way the security shifted closer to his side of the room, in the way no one interrupted him, in the way even the loudest voices dropped when he passed. And I realized this was not just some wealthy guest, not just someone important. This was someone who changed the temperature of a room without trying, someone people adjusted themselves around without being told, and my chest tightened because I had called that man baby like it meant nothing, like he was anyone else. And the memory replayed in my mind with painful clarity, the word leaving my lips so casually, his eyes locking onto mine so quickly, that smile forming like he had been handed something unexpected and interesting. And I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the next order, the next step, anything that would pull me back into normalcy. But then I felt it again, that subtle shift in awareness, like being watched without needing to look to confirm it, and against my better judgment, I glanced over, just for a second, just enough to see if he was still there. And of course he was, standing exactly where I had left him, speaking to one of the men beside him. But his eyes, they were not on the conversation, they were on me, steady, deliberate, like he had not lost track of me for even a moment, and something in my chest tightened in a way I could not explain. Because it was not just fear anymore, it was something else layered underneath, something that felt like being chosen without asking to be. And I quickly looked away, heart picking up speed as I told myself it did not mean anything, that I was overthinking, that once the night ended this would all fade into a strange story I would never tell anyone. But deep down, somewhere quiet and certain, I knew that was not true, because the way he had said my name, the way he had looked at me after, it did not feel temporary. It felt like the beginning of something I was not prepared for. And as I moved through the room, trying to hold on to the illusion of control, I could not stop hearing his voice in the back of my mind, calm and precise, like a warning I had not fully understood yet. And for the first time that night, I realized the mistake was not just saying the word, it was that he had heard it, and he had decided to remember me. It should have ended with that look, that warning, that quiet claim he never said out loud. But nights like this do not end when you want them to. They stretch, they tighten, they wait for the moment you slip again. And I could feel it building even as I moved through the crowd, balancing trays, repeating orders, smiling at people whose names I would forget the second they left, because part of me was no longer there. Part of me was stuck in that space between his eyes and mine, replaying every second, every word, every mistake. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more aware I became of everything around me. The way the air shifted when he moved, the way conversations adjusted to his presence without anyone acknowledging it, like the entire room operated on a rhythm. He controlled without effort, and I hated that I noticed, hated that I cared, because noticing meant involvement, and involvement meant risk, and I did not have room in my life for risk, not like this, not from someone like him. So I focused harder, moved faster, told myself this was just another shift, just another night, until I reached the far end of the room where the lighting softened and the noise dropped just enough to feel separate from everything else. And for a brief moment I let myself breathe, shoulders loosening, grip easing on the tray, thinking maybe I could make it through the rest of the night without crossing his path again. Maybe this would fade into something distant and manageable. But then a voice cut through that fragile calm. Too close, too casual. You look like you have seen a ghost. And I turned to find one of the guests leaning against the bar, his smile easy, his tone light. The kind of person who assumed attention was always welcome, and under normal circumstances I would have played along, offered the same polite responses I gave everyone else. But my nerves were already stretched thin, my focus already fractured, and I did not have the energy to pretend. Just a long shift, I said quietly, keeping my distance. But he did not take the hint, stepping closer instead, his presence crowding the space in a way that made my chest tighten. Not dangerous, not exactly, but unwanted. And I shifted slightly, trying to move past him without making a scene, because scenes were noticed, and noticed meant remembered. And I had already been remembered once tonight. I did not need it to happen again. But his hand reached out, not rough, just insistent, fingers brushing my arm as if to keep me there. And everything in me went still for a split second, not because of him, but because of the sudden awareness that washed over me, sharp and immediate, like stepping into cold water. And I did not need to look to know why. The room had changed. Again, subtly, quietly, the way it had before, and the man in front of me must have felt it too, because his grip loosened just slightly, his confidence flickering in a way that told me this shift was not in his control. And when I finally turned, slowly, carefully, my eyes found him again, closer now than before, standing just a few feet away with that same composed stillness, that same unreadable expression. But there was something different this time, something colder, more defined, not anger, not even irritation, just a clear, undeniable line being drawn without a single word spoken, and the man beside me followed my gaze, his posture changing instantly, hand dropping away like he had just realized. Something too late, something important, and for a moment no one spoke, no one moved, the silence settling in like a held breath, until the man beside me cleared his throat, stepping back with an awkward half-smile that did not reach his eyes, did not mean to interrupt. He muttered, already retreating, already disengaging in a way that felt abrupt and absolute. And just like that, the space was clear again, open, but not safe. Not anymore, because now he was there, directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the faint shift of light in his eyes, the controlled rise and fall of his breath, and I realized this was not coincidence, not proximity by chance. He had come here, to me, and my heart picked up speed despite everything I told it, because some part of me understood what that meant before my mind could catch up. And when he finally spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying only to me, it was not a question, not really. "You seem to attract attention," he said, and I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze even though it felt like stepping deeper into something I could not step back from. "I am just doing my job," I replied, but even as I said it, I knew it sounded smaller than it had before, less certain, and his eyes held mine for a second longer, that faint, dangerous smile returning like it had never left, and he leaned in just enough for his words to feel closer, more personal. "Then maybe you should let me decide who gets to interrupt you." And that was the moment I understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to feel it settle deep in my chest. This was no longer just about a mistake. It was about control, and whether I wanted it or not, I had just been placed inside his. His words should have felt like help, but they did not. They felt like a boundary I had not agreed to being drawn around me. Invisible, but very real. And for a second I forgot how to respond. Forgot the script I had been following all night. Because no one had ever said something like that to me before, not with that kind of quiet certainty, not like it was already decided, and I felt it again. That strange mix of fear and something I did not want to name, something that made my pulse unsteady, in a way that had nothing to do with the crowded room or the long shift, and I forced myself to breathe, to remember who I was before this moment, before him. "I can handle myself," I said, softer than I intended but steady enough to hold, and his expression did not change, not outwardly, but something in his eyes sharpened just slightly, like he had been expecting that answer, like it confirmed something he had already assumed. And for a brief second I wondered if I had just made things worse. Again, if every word I spoke was pulling me deeper into something I did not understand. But instead of pushing back, instead of correcting me, he simply nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he was allowing it, like he was giving me the space to believe that if I needed it, and that somehow unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant this was not about proving him wrong. It was about him choosing when to agree. And I did not like how easily that realization settled into place, did not. Like how quickly I started adjusting to it. And I shifted my weight slightly, aware of the tray still in my hands, the job I was supposed to be doing, the normal life I was supposed to return to the second this conversation ended. "I should get back," I added, gesturing slightly toward the rest of the room, hoping that would be enough to close this interaction, to step away without drawing more attention. But he did not move, did not step aside immediately, and for a heartbeat the space between us felt smaller, heavier, like time itself had slowed just enough to make the moment stretch. And then, almost as if remembering something, he glanced past me briefly, his attention shifting to one of the men waiting a few feet away, and that was all it took, the tension easing just enough for me to take a careful step to the side, moving past him without brushing against him, without making contact, because even that felt like something that could carry meaning now, and I kept walking, not too fast, not too slow, forcing myself back into the rhythm of the night, into the familiar motions of service and routine, but it was different now. Everything was, because I could still feel it, that awareness lingering like a shadow just out of sight, and no matter how many tables I visited, how many orders I repeated, part of me stayed alert, listening for his voice, tracking the shift in the room whenever he moved. And I hated that, hated how easily my focus had changed, how quickly one moment had rewritten the entire night, and I told myself it would fade. That once the event ended and the lights dimmed and the guests left, he would be just another memory, another face in a place I would not think about again. But deep down I knew that was not true, because people like him did not fade. They stayed, not always physically, but in the way they changed how you saw everything after, and I realized that even if I never saw him again, this moment would not disappear. It would linger in the quiet spaces, in the pauses between thoughts, in the way I chose my words more carefully than before, and that realization settled in slowly, quietly, like something inevitable, and I tried to push it aside, tried to focus on the next table, the next task, anything that would ground me back in reality. But then, just as I reached for a set of glasses near the bar, I heard it, his voice again, not directed at me this time, but close enough, clear enough to cut through everything else, and I froze for a fraction of a second before I could stop myself. Because even without looking, I knew he was still there, still watching, still aware. And something told me that this was not over, not yet, not even close, because moments like this did not end quietly. They unfolded, one step at a time, and whether I wanted to or not, I had already taken the first one. The sound of his voice should not have mattered when it was not meant for me, but it did. It cut through everything else like it had its own gravity, pulling my attention whether I wanted it or not, and I hated that I paused, even for a second, hated that my body reacted before my mind could catch up, because it meant I was already changing, already adjusting to his presence in a way that felt too natural for something that had only existed for a few minutes. And I forced myself to move again, to keep working, to focus on the tray in my hands and the order I needed to deliver. But the words I had just heard lingered, low and controlled, spoken to someone else, yet somehow still meant to be noticed, and I could not stop myself from wondering what he had said before, what he would say next. What kind of conversations happened around a man like him when no one was supposed to listen? And that curiosity felt dangerous, like stepping closer to something I should be walking away from. So I pushed it down, focused on the simple things, the weight of the glasses, the steady rhythm of my steps, the familiar routine that had always kept me grounded. But it was not working the way it used to. Not tonight. Not after everything that had already happened. And by the time I reached the next table, my hands were steady, but my thoughts were not. Drifting back to him without permission, replaying the way he had looked at me, the way he had said my name like it mattered, like it was something worth remembering, and I told myself it did not mean anything. That people like him remembered everything, because that was how they stayed in control, because information was power and I had just given him mine without thinking. But that explanation did not settle the feeling in my chest, did not explain why it felt personal when it should have been nothing more than calculated attention. And I was still trying to sort through that when I felt it again, that shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like the room itself had adjusted around a new movement. And this time I did not look right away. I kept my focus on the table in front of me, on the guest asking for another drink, on the small details that grounded me in reality, because I did not want to confirm what I already suspected, did not want to see him closer again, did not want to feel that awareness sharpen into something more. But then a shadow moved across the edge of my vision, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because I knew, I just knew. And when I finally looked up, slow and careful, he was there again, not across the room, not at a distance, but close enough that the space between us felt intentional, like he had crossed it on purpose, like he had chosen this exact moment. And the realization settled heavy in my chest, because it meant this was not coincidence, not curiosity fading away. It was something else entirely, something deliberate, and I straightened slightly without meaning to, adjusting my posture as if that would make a difference, as if it would give me back some control over a situation that was clearly slipping out of my hands. And for a second neither of us spoke, the noise of the room continuing around us like nothing had changed, like this moment was invisible to everyone else. And then he reached for the glass I had just set down, his fingers brushing against it in a movement that was so normal, so ordinary, that it should have broken the tension, but it did not, because nothing about him felt ordinary anymore, not after everything I had seen, everything I had felt. And when he looked at me again, that same calm intensity in his eyes, there was something new beneath it, something quieter but no less powerful, like a question he had not asked yet. And when he finally spoke, his voice low enough to stay between us, It was not what I expected, not a warning, not a command, just a simple observation that somehow carried more weight than either. "You are still here," he said, and I swallowed, forcing myself to respond even though my thoughts were still catching up. "I work here," I replied, but the words felt smaller this time, less like a statement and more like a reminder to myself, and his gaze lingered for a second longer, that faint hint of a smile returning. Not mocking, not amused, just there, like he was acknowledging something I had not fully understood yet. And for the first time since this started, I realized this was not about a single mistake anymore. It was about what came after, about the fact that I had not walked away, that I was still standing here, still within reach of something I did not know how to define, and the quiet certainty of that realization settled in slowly, like a truth I could not ignore, because whether I meant to or not, I was still part of his attention, and he had not decided to let it go. For a moment I did not answer because his words did not sound like a question, but they felt like one, like he was measuring something in the space between us, waiting to see if I understood what he was really saying, and I could feel it again, that quiet pressure building, not from the room, not from the noise or the people or the expectations of my job, but from him, from the way he stood there like nothing else demanded his attention, like time itself adjusted around his decisions, and I told myself to stay grounded, to remember who I was outside of this moment, outside of whatever influence he carried with him. "I have to be," I said finally, my voice steady enough to hold, even if my thoughts were not, and something in his expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like he recognized the answer, like it fit into something he had already decided about me. And that realization sent a quiet chill through my chest, because it meant I was no longer just reacting, I was being read, understood in ways I had not agreed to, and I tightened my grip on the tray slightly, anchoring myself in something familiar, something real, but it did not change the way he looked at me, did not break the connection that had formed somewhere between that first mistake and now. And for a second, I wondered what would happen if I just walked away, if I turned and left without waiting for permission, without giving him the chance to say anything else. But the thought stayed exactly that, a thought, because something in me knew it was not that simple anymore, not after everything that had already unfolded. And before I could decide what to do next, one of the men behind him stepped closer, leaning in just enough to speak quietly, words meant only for him, and I did not hear what was said, but I saw the effect, the slight shift in his posture, the brief narrowing of his eyes, not frustration, not anger, just calculation, like he was weighing something that mattered more than this conversation. And for the first time since he had approached me, his attention moved away, fully, completely, turning toward whatever had just been brought to him. And the change was immediate, the space between us opening in a way that felt both relieving and unsettling at the same time. Because without his focus on me, the intensity faded just enough for me to breathe again. But it also left behind something else, something quieter, like the absence of a weight I had already started adjusting to. And I took a small step back, then another, careful, measured, as if testing whether I was actually free to move. Now, and no one stopped me, no one called my name. And for a second it felt almost unreal, like stepping out of a moment that had not fully ended yet. And I turned, moving back into the rhythm of the room, into the safety of routine and distance, telling myself this was my chance, that whatever had just happened was over, that I could finish my shift, go home, and let this fade into something distant and unreal. But even as I told myself that, I could not shake the feeling that it was not entirely true, because I had seen the way he looked at me before he turned away, the way his attention had lingered just a second longer than necessary, like he was not done, like this was not a conclusion but a pause. And that thought stayed with me as I moved through the rest of the room, quieter now, more aware, more careful with every word, every glance, because I understood something I had not before, something that settled into place with a certainty I could not ignore. This was no longer about avoiding a mistake. It was about what happened after being noticed, and whether I wanted it or not, I had already crossed that line. And as the minutes passed and the night stretched on, I found myself listening without meaning to, waiting for that shift in the air again, that signal that he was moving, that he was near, and I hated how natural it felt, how quickly it had become part of my awareness, because it meant he had left an impression that was not going to disappear easily, not even when he was no longer standing in front of me. And just as I began to believe that maybe the distance would hold, that maybe the rest of the night would pass without another interruption, I felt it again. That same subtle shift, closer this time, sharper, like a presence returning instead of fading, and I did not need to turn to know exactly who it was. This time I did not pretend I did not notice, because pretending had stopped working the moment he decided I was worth noticing. And the awareness came first, a quiet shift that settled under my skin before anything else, before sight, before sound, like something instinctive telling me he was close again, and my breath slowed without my permission, my focus narrowing in a way that made everything else in the room feel distant, less important, like background noise fading behind something I could not ignore anymore. And I turned, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to confirm what I already knew. And there he was again, not standing where I had left him, not surrounded by conversation or distraction, but moving, crossing the space between us with that same controlled precision that made it look effortless, like distance was something he erased whenever he chose to. And this time it felt different, not like coincidence, not like curiosity, but like intention, like he had decided something in the moments we were apart, and I felt it settle in my chest before I could stop it. That quiet understanding that this was not random anymore. This was deliberate, and my fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the counter as I waited, because running now would only make it worse. Pretending now would only make it obvious, so I stayed where I was, letting the moment come to me instead of trying to escape it. And when he stopped in front of me again, closer than before, the space between us felt smaller, more defined, like it belonged to him as much as everything else seemed to. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough to remind me that he controlled when things began and when they ended. And then his gaze lifted fully to mine, steady, unwavering, like he had already decided I would not look away. And maybe that was the part that unsettled me the most, because he was right. I did not look away. I could not when it felt like this. Not when something in me had already started responding to him in ways I did not understand. And when he finally spoke, his voice low, measured, carrying only to me, it was not a question, not exactly. "You keep ending up near me," he said. And I almost laughed at that. Almost, because the truth was the opposite, because I had been trying to stay as far away as possible, but somehow the distance never held. And I shook my head slightly, a small, quiet denial that felt more honest than anything else I had said tonight. "I am just doing my job," I repeated, but even I could hear it. The way the words sounded thinner now, less certain, like they no longer explained anything. And his expression shifted again, that faint hint of something almost amused flickering for a second before settling back into something more controlled, more serious. And he stepped just a fraction closer, not enough to invade, not enough to force, but enough to make the space feel intentional, chosen. And I felt my heartbeat pick up despite everything I told myself, because proximity with him was not neutral. It carried weight. It changed things. And he tilted his head slightly, studying me like he had been doing all night, like he was still deciding something. And when he spoke again, it was softer, quieter, but somehow more certain. "Or maybe you are not trying very hard to stay away." And the words landed differently than everything else he had said. Not a warning, not a command, but something closer to a challenge, something that pushed back against the version of the situation I had been telling myself. And for a second, I did not know how to respond, because part of me wanted to deny it immediately, wanted to push back, to prove that I was still in control of my own choices. But another part, quieter and harder to ignore, hesitated, because if that were entirely true, I would have left, I would have avoided him, I would have made sure our paths did not cross again. And yet here I was, still standing in front of him, still answering, still part of whatever this had become. And that realization settled slowly, deeply, in a way that made my next breath feel heavier, more deliberate. And I met his gaze fully this time, not out of defiance, not entirely, but out of something closer to understanding. And I said, quietly but clearly, "Maybe I do not get to decide that anymore." And the second the words left my mouth, I felt it, the shift, subtle but undeniable, like something had just changed between us, something I could not take back. And his eyes held mine for a second longer, that same dangerous calm settling into place. But this time, there was something else. Beneath it, something more certain, more resolved, like he had been waiting for that answer. And when he finally spoke again, his voice low enough to feel personal, it carried a weight I understood immediately. You never did. And for the first time since this began, I realized this was not about a mistake that needed to be fixed. It was about a moment that had already decided its outcome. And whether I was ready for it or not, I had just stepped fully into it. His words did not feel loud, but they echoed anyway, settling somewhere deeper than sound, somewhere that made it harder to pretend this was still something small, something temporary, because the way he said it carried certainty, not arrogance, not force, just a quiet confidence that made it harder to argue. And for a second I forgot how to respond. Forgot the version of myself that had walked into this room hours ago thinking the night would be simple, predictable, safe, because none of those things applied anymore. Not after this, not after him. And I felt it then, not fear exactly, not even the sharp tension that had been following me since the beginning, but something steadier, heavier, like the moment had settled into place and I was standing inside it instead of trying to escape it. And I took a slow breath, grounding myself in something real, the cool edge of the counter under my fingers, the faint hum of conversation around us, the reminder that the world had not stopped even if mine had shifted slightly off balance. And when I looked at him again, really looked this time, I realized something that had been building quietly all night. He was not trying to scare me, not trying to overwhelm me. He was simply stating something he believed to be true, something he had already decided. And that realization changed the way the moment felt, made it less about resistance and more about understanding, and I straightened slightly without thinking, meeting his gaze in a way that felt more deliberate than before, more aware. That sounds like a decision you made on your own, I said quietly, and for the first time there was a pause in his expression, subtle but there, like I had shifted something just enough to be noticed, and it did not break the calm in his eyes, but it added something to it, something sharper, more interested, like he had not expected that answer, and now he was reconsidering something in response. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching in a way that felt different from before, less controlled by him, more balanced in a way I could not fully explain, and I felt it, that small shift in the dynamic. Not enough to change everything, but enough to matter, enough to remind me that I was still part of this, still capable of responding instead of just reacting. And something in my chest steadied because of it, because even if I did not fully understand what this was or where it was going, I was not entirely powerless inside it. And he watched me for a moment longer, that same measured focus, before the faintest hint of a smile returned, not as sharp as before, not as dangerous, just there, like an acknowledgement. And when he spoke again his voice carried the same quiet weight, but with something new beneath it, something almost approving. Most people would not say that, he said, and I let out a small breath I had not realized I was holding, because for the first time since this started it did not feel like a warning. It felt like recognition, and I shook my head slightly, a small, almost instinctive movement. Most people would not call you that by accident either, I replied, and for a second the words hung between us, light but not insignificant, and his gaze held mine just a fraction longer, like he was considering them, like he was deciding what they meant. And then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if something had settled into place, and the space between us shifted again, not closing, not tightening, but changing in a way that felt quieter, more certain, and I realized then that this was not about ending the moment anymore. It was about what came after it, about the fact that neither of us had walked away when we could have, that we were both still here, still choosing to stay in this conversation even as the rest of the night continued around us. And that understanding settled in slowly, like something inevitable, because moments like this did not just disappear. They turned into something else, something that lingered long after the room emptied and the lights went down. And as I stood there, still holding his gaze, still aware of the space he occupied and the way it had changed mine, I realized this was not something I could undo, not something I could pretend never happened, because whether I wanted to or not, he had noticed me, and more than that, he had decided I was worth remembering, and something told me that was the part that would matter long after this night was over.